Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I find myself in an unusual position this sitting period to stand to support a government bill, this being the Commerce Commission International Cooperation and Fees Bill. The reason I say this, sir, is because the budget, certainly the budget and supporting tax legislation, was definitely one of those pieces of legislation for the few and not the many, as it delivered massive tax cuts to the most wealthy Kiwis, whilst delivering practically nothing for ordinary New Zealand families and households. No, it did deliver something. It delivered GST increases and it delivered huge inflation. But anyway, for this bill, dishonest? Do you want to know what dishonest is? I will not increase GST. I will not increase GST. That is dishonest. That is dishonest. Anyway, as for this bill, Mr Speaker, it's another one of those bills originally introduced by my colleague, the Honourable Leanne Dilsell, in 2008, and now in the name of the Honourable Simon Power. In fact, I wonder what Simon Power is actually going to do when the rest of Leanne Dilsell's legislation gets passed, because I think this is actually the second piece. This is the second piece of Leanne's legislation I've spoken on the last month. Are there any more of her pieces of legislation, Mr Power, to come before the House? Or is this the last one of hers that you've adopted? And I must admit, Mr Speaker, I did find it quite amusing when a couple of the National speakers stood up and said, this is a centrepiece of the national policy of driving economic growth. Well, it was a Labour bill. It's a Labour bill, for goodness sake. Anyway, there's no doubt about it that Leanne Dilsell was a very busy minister, and that's great. As already outlined, the proposal in this bill are part of the work program for supporting a memorandum of understanding on business law coordination with Australia. The current MOU was signed by Leanne Dilsell and Australia's Peter Costello in 2006. This MOU is a centrepiece for single economic market agenda with Australia, which explicitly recognises the trends towards international convergence in the regulation of financial markets and business regulation. If members over the other side choose to listen, they might actually learn something. Apparently, this is part of their economic agenda. Well, it was our economic agenda for 9 years. So yeah, you're dead right, it is too late for John Hayes to learn. But he should listen and he might learn something. Yeah, it is unlikely. You're dead right, it is unlikely. Most important, this bill is, Mr Speaker, considering we have seen recently in both our domestic and international markets, due to what many would perceive the fundamental breakdown in the regulatory framework governing the investment banking sector and the shadow banking system, especially in the United States. But we were not immune by any stretch of the imagination, and countless Kiwis lost thousands of dollars, some of their whole life saving, due to the unscrupulous behaviour of some true rogues. The crisis and the resulting recession, which over the last couple of years, Mr Speaker, wasn't just a case of problems associated with financial deregulation, even though this didn't help, but according to Professor Krugman, himself a Nobel laureate, it involved risks undertaken by institutions that were never regulated in the first place. Now, whilst this bill doesn't deal with this specific issue head-on, it is one piece of the legislative jigsaw that is needed to guard the future security of the world's citizens from unscrupulous and predatory behaviour on behalf of those that seek to rip the heart out of our communities. So it's an important step in the process of tightening the regulatory environment by providing an efficient regime that facilitates enhanced cooperation between the Commission and overseas regulators, whilst ensuring appropriate safeguards are in place to address public interest considerations. As mentioned, this bill aligns us with Australia, who passed similar legislation in 2007. So this is an important piece of legislation in terms of regulatory and economic alignment introduced by Labour. The Australians actually thought this a very important piece of legislation in terms of developing a regulatory framework in line with international best practice. And I suppose the question must be asked, Mr Speaker, is if the Australians thought this legislation so important, and I think it is as well, I'd agree with that, why has it taken Mr Power so long to bring this bill before the House? We have had we've been under urgency passing things like second-hand car dealers' bills and this sort of carry-on, and here we're talking about financial regulation between New Zealand and Australia. I would have thought this was quite important. But anyway, we've had numerous terms of urgency under this government, debating various bills. One could, I think, very successfully argue do not have nearly the positive impact this bill actually does. So much for the rhetoric around increasing productivity and harmony with Australia, Mr Speaker, or aligning regulatory framework and providing protection for ordinary New Zealanders. Anyway, Mr Speaker, here we are. What this bill does is provide powers for the Commerce Commission to use its statutory tools to assist as overseas competition or consumer regulator with an investigation. It's a very good idea. The bill will promote more effective and efficient enforcement of competition and consumer protection law in the global economy. Mr Speaker, in this day and age of globalisation, New Zealand needs to ensure that we are at the cutting edge of regulation designed to ensure that our citizens never again are taken advantage of like they were by the shady characters running the shonky finance companies, preying on the elderly and the vulnerable. Well, whilst we'll never be able to totally eliminate this risk, what we can do is put legislation in place to at least mitigate the risks. This is one of these pieces of legislation, Mr Speaker, and it is a fundamental part of the Labour philosophy of looking after the many and not the few. This doesn't just refer to developing a fairer tax system which benefits all Kiwis, not the lucky few, but backed up by a regulatory framework that so serves and protects the many from the few. And it's quite interesting because we're talking about New Zealand and Australian alignment of regulation here. And who would have imagined 10 years ago, Mr Speaker, that a man who had defrauded hundreds or thousands of New Zealanders out of millions of dollars will fly back from a Sydney penthouse each time he has to do his community service sentence? It would almost be comical if it wasn't so obscene. Mr Speaker, closer economic alignment with Australia, while still maintaining our economic sovereignty, which of course is very important, is another important platform of Labour's economic and foreign affairs philosophy. This bill is about best practice, and as I've mentioned, follows the signing of a joint agreement between the Honourable Leanne Dalzell and Peter Costello. We all know the Prime Minister bangs on about catching up with Australia, which is what this is about, and yet this government wouldn't even let a bill on compulsory redundancy, which is law in Australia, go through to committee stage in order to let the public have their say. So whilst the Australian government increases worker superannuation, this government cuts the Cullen Fund and continues to erode workers' rights. Mr Speaker, this bill will help relationships between New Zealand and Australia, but what would really help cement a relationship is closer alignment of worker pay and conditions. And I note with interest how all workers in New Zealand have received a massive pay increase in order to align them with their Australian counterparts doing the same job. The path to economic prosperity is not tax cuts for the most fortunate, but increasing the salaries and wages, as any who know anything about economics and economic history and philosophy will understand, that there is a direct correlation between wage rates and productivity. Sir, this bill complements the Trans-Tasman Treaty on court proceedings that was signed by, you guessed it, not the Honourable Simon Power, but Leanne Dalzell when Labour was in government. That bill is currently before Select Committee, I understand, and while the bill concentrates on enforcement, this bill aims to facilitate mutual assistance during the investigative stages through to enforcement proceedings. Mr Speaker, this is a good bill, a helpful bill, a constructive bill, a focused bill. It is a Labour bill, and I commend it to the House.